Hi, everyone. I was asked to give a presentation on Beethoven. And the thing about doing a presentation on somebody whose music gets copyrighted whenever anyone performs it is that you can't really show it on a presentation. But that's okay. And in fact, I think it might even work in my favor because I'm going to set to prove something to you. The thing about Beethoven is that in 1799, he starts realizing that there's something going on with his hearing. It's looking like he might be deaf. So 1799, 1800, he's trying to figure this whole thing out. And then in 1802, he writes that he's come to terms with the fact that he may never be cured. He holds out hope, hopefully, that he might be cured someday, somehow. But ultimately, he says, well, it is what it is. Then, 12 years later, 1814, Beethoven is now completely deaf. And from 1814 to 1827, Beethoven continues to live. However, in those 13 years of his life, he's completely deaf. So from the age of 44 to the age of 57, he's deaf. Can't hear a thing. Can't hear a lick of anything, let alone hear his own music. But what does that mean exactly? Because between the period of 1814 and 1827, Beethoven wrote 6 piano sonatas. Piano sonatas 27 all the way to 32. He wrote 2 cello sonatas, 4 and 5. He wrote Symphony Number 8 and his most famous symphony, Number 9. It's the one with the Ode to Joy chorale in it. He wrote the late string quartets. That's the Opus 127, 130, 133, and the 135, which includes the Grosse Fuge, or in English, the Great Fugue, which, if you haven't heard, you should hear. It is amazing. There's a double fugue there. And as to what that means, well, you should listen, and then you will figure that out. But ultimately, it's amazing. And of course, he wrote the Missa Solemnis, which was a mass, a vocal work, and people call it the hardest choral piece to perform today. But how did he do it? He wrote so much more than just those things, so how was he able to do it without hearing anything that he wrote after 1814? Well, what was going on? Well, Beethoven used to remark that music is not about what you hear. Well, what does that mean? Mozart and probably Bach would have said the same thing, that music is not about what you hear. Although in Beethoven's case, it's kind of different because Beethoven actually couldn't hear in the last periods of his life. And yet the last periods of his life is when people consider his compositions to be the greatest. I happen to think they're all equally great, though some are better than others. My personal favorite is the late string quartets. But how did he do? What is happening there that you can compose such great pieces of art and music and you can't hear anything? Well, maybe it's not what you hear. Take Helen Keller, for example. Helen Keller, in 1924, writes a letter to the New York Symphony Orchestra. And here's what the letter said.
Dear friends, I have the joy of being able to tell you that, though deaf and blind, I spent a glorious hour last night listening over the radio to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. I do not mean to say that I heard the music, in the sense that other people heard it, and I do not know whether I can make you understand how it was possible for me to derive pleasure from the symphony. It was a great surprise to myself. I had been reading in my magazine for the blind of the happiness that the radio was bringing to the sightless everywhere. I was delighted to know that the blind had gained a new source of enjoyment, but I did not dream that I could have any part in their joy. Last night, when the family was listening to your wonderful rendering of the Immortal Symphony, someone suggested that I put my hand on the receiver and see if I could get any of the vibrations. He unscrewed the cap, and I lightly touched the sensitive diaphragm. What was my amazement to discover that I could feel not only the vibration, but also the impassioned rhythm, the throb, and the urge of the music. The intertwined and intermingling vibrations from different instruments enchanted me. I could actually distinguish the cornets, the royal of the drums, deep-toned violas, and violins singing in exquisite unison. How the lovely speech of the violins flowed and ploughed over the deepest tones of the other instruments! When the human voices leaped up thrilling from the surge of harmony, I recognized them instantly as voices more ecstatic, upcurving, swift, and flame-like, until my heart almost stood still. The women's voices seemed an embodiment of all the angelic voices rushing in a harmonious flood of beautiful and inspiring sound. The great chorus throbbed against my fingers with poignant pause and flow. Then all the instruments and voices together burst forth, an ocean of heavenly vibration, and died away like winds when the atom is spent, ending in a delicate shower of sweet notes. Of course, this was not hearing, but I do know that the tones and harmonies conveyed to me moods of great beauty and majesty. I also sense, or thought I did, the tender sounds of nature that sing into my hand-swaying reeds and winds and the murmur of streams. I have never been so enraptured before by a multitude of tone vibrations. As I listened, with darkness and melody, shadow and sound filling all the room, I could not help remembering that the great composer who poured forth such a flood of sweetness in the world was deaf like myself. I marveled at the power of his quenchless spirit, by which out of his pain he wrought such joy for others. And there I sat, feeling with my hand the magnificent symphony which broke like a sea upon the silent shores of his soul and mine.
Now, why was she able to hear Beethoven's Ninth Symphony despite the fact that she's deaf and blind too? Yet she was able to envision something. She says herself she was able to distinguish between two tones. I believe she herself says in her own letter, she says, how the lovely speech of the violins flowed and plowed over the deepest tones of the other instruments. Clearly she could recognize higher tone and lower tone. She can even recognize human voices. And this is someone who has no idea what a human voice, let alone a singing human voice, would even sound like. Yet, she was able to distinguish what a human voice sounds like versus what an instrumental voice sounds like. So what does that say about the human voice? And what does that say about instruments? And what does that say about listening? The senses actually prevent us or withhold us from really understanding what it is that Beethoven is getting at through his Ninth Symphony and his other compositions. But what is that getting at that Beethoven is trying to get to? What is Beethoven really trying to convey? Beethoven has said, music is a higher revelation than all wisdom and philosophy. And he also said, don't only practice your art, but force your way into its secrets, for it and knowledge can raise men to the divine. What secrets was Beethoven able to unlock through his music? And why is it in what you can't hear? Maybe there's something behind the note, something unnameable, an unnameable world that exists between the notes, above the notes, below the notes. And this is something that Helen Keller understood, because in the beginning of her letter, she says, I do not mean to say that I heard the music in the sense that other people heard it, and I do not know whether I can make you understand how it was possible for me to derive pleasure from the symphony. Because she can hear things and see things in ways that we can't, because our own senses betray us.